morning, gentlemen. As you can see, we call ourselves the USNA's Trident Consulting Firm. I'm Nick Costa.
I'm Amy McClellan.
I'm David Larkin.
And today we have for you a very troubling case, but it's very necessary that we talk about this case. And the case deals with the practice of Bacha Bazi in Afghanistan. Bacha Bazi, for all intents and purposes, is a practice in which a very powerful man, usually in the Afghan military or in the Afghan police, will literally buy or even steal a young boy or a young girl and dress that person up in feminine clothes and force that person to do very suggestive dances. And the case literally said, turn that person into a sex slave. They will rape that individual, they will use that individual for sexual exploitation. And as you can see, the practice is very morally repugnant, and the United States military ran into this practice quite often in the Afghan police force, especially as the case outlined with the case of Captain Quinn and Sergeant Martlin. These two were training Afghan police, they were doing their mission, and they encountered an individual that they knew was engaging in the practice of Bacha Bazi. And in trying to explain to that individual why a leader doesn't do something like that, it didn't go too well. It essentially went in one ear and out the other. And Captain Quinn grew frustrated. Captain Quinn picked that individual up and threw him on the ground. And as a result, Captain Quinn was relieved of his command, and under his own volition, he left the Army. And with that, my colleague David is going to get more into our task at hand today.
So we have one important task, and that is to advise the head of U.S. forces in Afghanistan regarding the ROE to subordinate commanders, as well as a plan of action for himself and the personnel under his command. And this is really going to, so the first one is going to deal with a dynamic ROE that we are going to present that is going to deal with kinetic problems that they see on the ground. The plan of action for the commander is more of a thematic plan of action that is going to deal with a culture change within the United States bases and the Afghan military and government structure as a whole that is founded on a zero-tolerance policy of the practice of Bacha Bazi. With that, I'd like to pass it off. We're also going to deal with these other questions at the end of our presentation. With that, I'd like to pass it off to Amy, who's going to talk about the legal boundaries that we are dealing with.
So the first thing that we're going to look at is whether or not it is legal to ban Bacha Bazi and other sexual crimes on U.S. bases. One of the biggest things that is currently going through Congress in forms of legislation is the Martlin Act, which was created in response to Sergeant Martlin and Captain Quinn's case. The specific act states that we will not condone any sort of sexual crimes or child abuse happening on U.S. bases, which means that we will not make it acceptable and we will basically enforce a zero-tolerance policy. However, in case this act does not go through the Congress, we can look at the U.S. Department of Justice's U.S. Code Section 3261, which basically states that any law that is punishable with more than a year of jail time in the United States also applies on U.S. bases and U.S. installations overseas. This law also states that it applies to not only U.S. citizens, but people who are working with us, even if they are foreign nationals, which includes the ALP and the Afghan military forces. The next thing we have to look at is whether it is legal under current ROE to actively pursue perpetrators of Bacha Bazi in the field. Currently, Bacha Bazi is placed under what we call operationally non-critical events, which means that we don't expect to see this when we're out in the field, but we still have an ROE in place just in case. Our examples of this are active shooters and human trafficking. The current ROE for these is to report it to the MPs, kind of wait for something to happen, but do not actively engage. This is mainly because we see safety as a big issue. It is more mission critical that we keep our sailors and soldiers alive than it is for them to actively engage something without proper training. However, we feel that Bacha Bazi is an operationally critical event that is necessary to eliminate in order to achieve our mission in Afghanistan. And in order to explain that further, I will pass it along to my colleague Dave, who will explain exactly why it is so important to eliminate this practice.
So for the past 15 years, the United States military has had a policy, whether stated or not stated, that basically ignores the practice, even on U.S. military bases. So we talked to a couple of Marines here at the Academy who served in Afghanistan and encountered these problems to a varying degree. And their primary reason for their support of the U.S. policy obviously was obeying the chain of command. But they also backed it up with talking about the strategy. And our mission there in Afghanistan wasn't to be moral enforcers and to change the morals of Afghanistan to be more like ours. So we took a look at the strategy and specifically the mission of the U.S. forces in Afghanistan, and we came to a different conclusion. We think that it actually damaged our strategy. That policy that we had of not confronting the issue and ignoring it actually damaged our strategic mission in Afghanistan. So what was our mission? Our mission was primarily to dismantle Al-Qaeda. In order to do that, we had to remove the Taliban from power. So how do we do that? We began with a large-scale military operation. We invaded Afghanistan in 2001. After we invaded and removed the Taliban from its power and pushed them into the mountains, we faced an insurgency. And to deal with that insurgency, we developed COIN, the counterinsurgency doctrine. Part of that doctrine talks about strengthening legitimacy and the capacity of the government institutions to govern responsibly. In order to help achieve this, we focus, at least in our part, on Afghan sovereignty. So we didn't interfere with Afghan policy. We advised them, we supported them, but we didn't make sure that they enforced their own policies or develop policies for them. The case of Bacha Bazi, though, threw a wrench into that plan. I'd like to draw a distinction here between the way that Afghans view Bacha Bazi and Americans. Here in America, it's very morally repugnant. When I read the case, I got really, really mad about what was happening. When people in Afghanistan see this, they don't necessarily have the same reaction. However, it's not viewed as okay, as some would suggest. It is viewed as exploitative and corrupt. As such, when the government is actively engaged in this behavior and chooses not to enforce their own laws, they lose the legitimacy that we were trying to gain through our counterinsurgency doctrine. They are not governing responsibly, and as a result, the people are more likely to support the Taliban than the government. So our strategy needs to change, our policy needs to change to help our strategy of counterinsurgency by enforcing this zero-tolerance policy and setting a clear example that will help the Afghan government strengthen its legitimacy and their capacity to govern responsibly. I'd like to pass it off to my colleague Nick now, who will explain the moral backbone of our case.
As my colleague just established, a strategic imperative has been put in place to end the practice of Bacha Bazi. But when we start talking about ethics, we want to make sure that we're actually doing the right thing, that we're answering the question, what should I do? And any discussion of ethics requires an identification of stakeholders at play. This case has a lot of stakeholders: the American people's trust in the American military, the Afghan people's trust in the Afghan government military. But we feel that the two biggest stakeholders specific to the practice of Bacha Bazi are the child that is being raped and the American soldier that wants to intervene and stop Bacha Bazi. And the way that we're going to look at the moral imperatives upon both of these stakeholders is through a deontological, a teleological, and a natural law perspective. When we're talking about deontology, we're talking about Kant and duty-based ethics. We're talking about what are the means of the ends here. And when we look at the practice of Bacha Bazi, children, human lives are being used as means to the end of sexual gratification, as means to the end of sexual exploitation. And as a result, the American military feels a duty to step in and stop that. They feel as though that's what they should do. And furthermore, if we get into a teleological discussion, what are the consequences of allowing this thing to happen? Bacha Bazi might actually have some positive consequences for the child. The child's family might receive money. The child's family might be elevated in status because the commander picked their son because he looks pretty. However, any positive consequences that might come out of it are very heavily outweighed by the negative consequences of physical and psychological damage that a child feels when it's raped at a very early age. There are also very negative consequences that befall our American soldiers who get frustrated and who feel very depressed that their moral inclinations were repressed, that they couldn't act upon what they felt was a grave moral wrongdoing. And that concept of natural inclinations leads us into a discussion of natural law, the belief that all humans have these natural inclinations, these universal inclinations, and two very important ones for this case are the inclination toward life and the inclination toward sociability. And when we talk about life of the child, we're not necessarily talking about life and death. We're talking about the difference between existing and living a flourishing life, and the child is being deprived of that ability by being raped. Furthermore, sociability of the child and his ability to grow as a thriving member of global society is impeded. And a discussion of natural law brings forth a discussion of just war. How do we know that we're intervening with Bacha Bazi in the right way? Because as many things in war, as many things with intervention, there's a right and a wrong way to do it. In terms of stopping Bacha Bazi, we can actually think about it as a jus ad bellum situation, a justice before war, and not necessarily a justice in war situation, because we're making a decision to do something. And of the many tenets of jus ad bellum, the most important for us today is the establishment of legitimate authority, because it's pretty obvious that we have a just cause. We want to stop something as bad as child rape, and we have the right intention. We want to help children. But do we have the legitimate authority to do so outside of our borders in Afghanistan? And we feel that our proposed solution and our proposed zero-tolerance policy on base provides us with that legitimate authority. And without further ado, I'd like to pass it off to my colleagues who will get into more specifics about our proposed solution.
So we're going to, right now, forego discussion as far as UN policy and address at the end. We're going to focus on our two most important objectives today, which is the policy for the commander in regards to the change in command climate and the proposed ROE. So there's three parts of this change in command climate. The first has to do with the zero tolerance policy. I like to use an analogy of the way the U.S. military handles drug abuse. There's a zero tolerance policy, and as such, the majority of the members of the U.S. military do not use drugs when they're in the service. If they ever do get caught using drugs, they're immediately removed and discharged from the U.S. military. This has created a climate where drugs are absolutely unacceptable. However, if you look at the way that the U.S. military handles underage drinking, it's not a zero tolerance policy. If someone is caught, they might get punished to some degree, but they're probably not necessarily getting removed from the military. And as such, the climate in regards to how the military sees underage drinking is very different from the drug abuse and a lot more acceptable. So we recommend that in order to make Bacha Bazi absolutely unacceptable, we create this zero tolerance policy that is absolutely enforced. If an Afghan commander or a policeman is found to be engaged in this practice, they will be removed from the U.S. military base. They will not be allowed to ever command on that U.S. military base again or other military bases. The second part of this is a complete transparency between the U.S. commanders and Afghan commanders. There needs to be expectations that are set in regards to how these laws are going to be enforced. We expect Afghan commanders to enforce the policies that they have already stated. It is Afghan law that Bacha Bazi is not allowed. The military, the police force, the government needs to enforce those laws, and we need to make it clear that we expect them to. And this is all part of the counterinsurgency doctrine, the effort to help create a legitimate government in Afghanistan. Finally, how should we execute this, specifically on military bases? We believe military police are the most apt to handle these situations. They're going to be specifically trained to handle the situation. However, it is the duty of everyone on base to, if they see something suspicious, if they think this is going on, to report it to the proper authorities and allow military police to handle it.
And with that, we've talked a lot about, and so did the case, a lot about our policies on base, what should be done, what should we tell our commanders to do on base. But it's very easy to imagine a hypothetical situation where a Marine or Army patrol goes off base and encounters the practice, even with an Afghan commander, an Afghan military officer. And what do we do then? Do we then tell our soldiers, since they're not on base, that they're not allowed to intervene anymore? That would seem a little bit unfair, because then we're still restricting their moral inclinations. So what we propose is a very clearly defined rules of engagement and a very clearly defined communication between soldier and a higher ranking officer who can then, a higher ranking military officer that we trust to make decisions, to make a decision for that soldier. We propose the ability to still intervene. We think that soldiers should be able to step in and stop Bacha Bazi even off base after asking basically permission from a higher ranking official. And on both sides of that stream of communication, there will be a very detailed and standardized decision-making process. And to help walk you through and give you an example of the decision-making process, my colleague Amy will give an example.
So this is our example that we have set up for a potential decision-making process for the people on the field as well as the people back at base that they'll radio back can go through really quickly. The two things that we discussed in here mostly deal with jurisdiction and safety. The first thing is that we want to make sure that when we are actively engaging perpetrators of Bacha Bazi, that it is within our legal bounds to do so, that the legal framework is there. So mostly we are dealing with Afghan military forces and police forces, because currently that is what the law says that we can engage with. The second thing is safety. We want to make sure that we are taking no extra risk, that we are not putting our lives in serious danger. We don't want one person to try to engage possibly 5 maybe armed perpetrators. That would be a bad day for all of us. And to continue, we will go over the questions and tasks again to make sure that we answered everything.
the last thing that we'd like to do today is we'd like to, one at a time, address each one of the points that we were asked to answer. And the first one, our primary objective was to advise the head of U.S. Forces Afghanistan in creating a policy for subordinate commanders,
5 minutes remaining.
as well as a plan of action for the commander himself. And we feel that we've accomplished this. The policy in ROE was very clearly defined. On base, you have a zero-tolerance policy, and off base, you create a clear ROE that requires communication and permission to be given by a higher-ranking official. The plan of action for the commander himself is a lot more thematic, as my colleague said. It's a lot more about commanders sitting down with Afghan commanders and enforcing that zero-tolerance policy and ensuring that proper steps are taken in order to change command climate.
So the next thing we need to discuss is what is the proper UN response to the practice of Bacha Bazi. We hope that the UN will mirror our zero-tolerance policy as it already falls in line with multiple US doctrines and all the different resolutions that deal with being more stringent upon the Afghan government in enforcing these laws. We also hope that we can have a multilateral implementation of the ROE that we discussed, since the US is not the only group and country that is helping train these Afghan military forces. We also know that the Germans and the French are doing so, and by presenting a united front, we can eliminate this problem faster and more efficiently. The next thing is, as we discussed, we do not believe that our soldiers' actions should be limited to simply reporting it. We believe that with a legitimate authority, we can actively engage and hopefully solve this process. We do not think that our Afghan partners should be allowed to house boys on US bases if the purpose of housing these boys is to further the practice of Bacha Bazi.
And the next question is admittedly a lot tougher. Were Captain Quinn and Sergeant Martin treated fairly? And our short answer is yes, they were treated fairly, especially in the case of Captain Quinn, an American military officer who was expected to have the mental fortitude and the moral resolve to be able to stand firm even in a morally frustrating situation and not slam people down who never attacked him. However, that being said, we completely understand why Captain Quinn is frustrated. We would be too. Imagine a situation where you see something so morally repugnant as child rape going on, and there's no ROEs in place, there's no zero-tolerance policy in place, there's no official guidance as to what to do, and this person is not listening to any lessons you have to teach him. For all intents and purposes, Captain Quinn felt that the only thing he could do was take physical action, and we feel that's unfair to Captain Quinn. The system should not be set up to where our soldiers feel the only thing they can do to stop a moral wrong is throw people on the ground. And as a result, we feel that we were able to mitigate that by proposing this new ROE and this new zero-tolerance policy.
So is Bacha Bazi so ingrained in Afghan culture that we're basically on a mission we can't achieve? We don't think so. Yes, Bacha Bazi is a long-standing tradition in Afghan culture. Yes, it's going to be difficult to eradicate it within the Afghan government. However, the Taliban was able to effectively do so prior to our invasion in 2001. Prior to 2001, this practice was not happening because the Taliban strictly enforced a zero-tolerance policy on it. We expect, in order to create this legitimate government, now granted, Taliban does operate a little bit differently than we would expect the Afghan government to. It's more oppressive and perhaps even better suited to address this issue. However, we're trying to create a legitimate government that obeys its own laws. It doesn't expect, there isn't a double standard between what it expects of its people and those in positions of power, and we believe that's completely achievable. It's going to be difficult. It's going to require some very hard actions, some very difficult decisions to be made, where Afghan commanders will get relieved or get removed from military bases, and it might even create some tension between Afghan commanders and U.S. commanders. However, we believe that it is absolutely necessary, and we believe it's achievable in order to remove the practice of Bacha Bazi from the Afghan government.
And the last question deals with a hypothetical. If we accept Bacha Bazi as unchangeable, which we do not, but if we were to accept it as unchangeable, should we acquiesce to the practice and just tolerate it, kind of the way we were okay with working with the Soviet Union during World War II, even though we didn't always get along? And our answer to that is no, for two reasons. The most important reason is that the American military in and of itself also has a reputation of legitimacy to uphold. If we don't interact and we don't stop a corrupt practice, we also look corrupt in the eyes of the Afghan government. That brings me to my second point. If our mission is truly counterinsurgency, a very important part of the counterinsurgency mission is to imbue ourselves with the trust of the Afghan people, as well as the trust of the Afghan military. And if we allow corrupting practices to occur, that doesn't happen. Now that being said, in a situation where Bacha Bazi is truly unchangeable, what do we do if we can't complete the mission of counterinsurgency? If the mission is truly counterinsurgency and Bacha Bazi is unchangeable, we feel that those two pull on each other so hard that the mission would necessarily have to be changed. Counterinsurgency doesn't really work when you're promoting a corrupt government. However, the mission can still be to drive out Al-Qaeda, to drive out the Taliban, and to ensure that terrorist cells do not pop up in Afghanistan. And that mission isn't necessarily dependent on eliminating an unchangeable practice.
You are out of time, sorry.
With that, we'd like to move forward to questions.
Questions.
Yes, sir.
So imagine I'm a local Afghan citizen who disagrees with the U.S. invasion. What moral leg does the U.S. have to stand on to criticize my country if you invaded us?
Sir, to answer your question, legally, we actually don't. The section 3261 only gives us jurisdiction over Afghan forces and police forces. However, you asked the question on a moral basis, and I feel that that legitimate authority comes from the principle of forfeiture. If you object to something that we feel we are promoting a morally objective, correct thing. In other words, we feel that the abuse of a child and the rape of a child is objectively morally wrong. It doesn't matter that we're American and that you're Afghan. I'm a person and you're a person. And people who engage in that practice are wrong. And if you're objecting specifically to my stepping in and stopping child abuse, I would say you're overstepping your moral boundaries because I'm doing a proper thing. If you legitimately object to my presence in Afghanistan, if you think that the Taliban is truly a legitimate government, you're within your rights to do so. You have a moral right to voice your opinion. But at the same time, we can have an argument about who is the moral agent here. Is the Taliban better to rule Afghanistan, or is some democratic government better to rule Afghanistan? Does that answer your questions?
Controlling U.S. bases is one issue,
Yes, sir.
and that's probably, if there's anything easy about it, kicking somebody off the base, regardless of the political consequences and how high up the person was, may help solve the Bacha Bazi problem on the base and keeping the boys off the base. But my question is, you said that off the base, that it had to be a cooperation between the Afghans and the U.S. forces to work together, and that the Afghans are expected to enforce the law. How far, let's assume that they don't enforce it, that it continues and our troops see it going on, and how far do we go when you're out in the field somewhere? How far do your people go in terms of trying to ensure that this doesn't happen out there?
So one thing that we can do if we do not see this change happening is to put more pressure on Afghan commanders. As an invasion force and as a force that helps set up the government of Afghanistan, we have a significant amount of push and pull with those Afghan commanders to get what we want done. I think that's where we should focus our efforts if we do not see the change reflected after those first initial conversations that we expect immediately as far as the zero tolerance policy. On the ground, we want to answer that on the ground
Yes,
question?
sir. So the proposed decision-making process we put up actually gives American personnel the means to go in and cease the practice, especially if the practice is being done by an Afghan military member, an Afghan police member. And we're fortunate that the practice is basically a necessity of the practice is that the man doing it has to be in a position of power. And if the Taliban doesn't tolerate it, and we can make sure the military doesn't tolerate it, there's not a whole lot of positions of power left for those people to go to. Regardless, how far exactly can we go is unfortunately a very difficult question to answer, which is why we want two things to happen. We want the decision-making process to be in the hands of the military personnel who are supposed to make decisions, high-ranking officers. We also want the decision-making process to be brief. We don't want an officer to get a call that says, can I go into a house and stop Bacha Bazi without him knowing what it is. That involves education, that involves briefing, that involves the change in command climate. It needs to be brought out into the open. People need to know what it is. People need to know that the American military doesn't tolerate it. And if that's the case, the Afghan military will begin to reflect that policy. And if the Afghan military truly doesn't tolerate the policy, The Taliban doesn't truly tolerate the policy. The government doesn't truly tolerate the policy. Those who engage in Bacha Bazi have nowhere else left to go. They have nowhere else left to do it.
Quick follow-up.
Yes, sir.
If moral suasion doesn't work, it would seem to me that, and I don't know how difficult this is, that you certainly could be able to convince some of those people if you said, you guys keep this practice up, you don't get any more money, you don't get any arms, you don't get any supplies.
That's what I'm talking about. And the reason we didn't do that was because we were worried about the response to that and losing people. Like, you remove a 3-star general, in Afghanistan, that's a big issue. However, we think that what was happening with the counterinsurgency doctrine, part of the reason that the government wasn't as effective as we hoped is because they were corrupt and they were exploiting. So we think it's a necessary step in order to achieve that legitimacy.
And our presentation sort of hinged between two extremes. There was the unchangeable hypothetical, and we can step in and change it. But as you said, real life is going to be somewhere in between. So an incrementalist approach can work, for sure.
This is an implementation question.
Yes, sir.
So many of our bases are joint use, joint authority. How do you practically implement this when a wall just separates you? And in Bacha Bazi, by your policy, it is only control of U.S. portions or U.S. only bases.
So I think that's one of the reasons why we really want to push this whole multilateral implementation through the UN. Most of the other forces that are also training the military and the police there are German, are French. They're common allies for us. The UN has already talked multiple times about how we need to really crack down on this, how this is a serious issue that everyone should address and everyone has an invested stake in. So our hope is that the other countries that are working with us will agree with us that this needs to be eliminated and mirror our practices. However, from a moral standpoint, our soldiers should stick to our ROE.
It is a primarily NATO force in Afghanistan too, and we can go through NATO channels to get the same, the cooperation that is needed.
I'm going to do a follow-up
Yeah, no
because
problem at all.
I didn't really,
Get your question answered?
not really. Okay, so will you still have the obligation to act in joint use bases when when you become aware of this practice on the Afghan side of that wall? Are you legally, morally obligated by your policy to act?
Especially morally, sir, yes. We are of the opinion that a counterinsurgency mission cannot be accomplished if a corruptive practice is taking place on our side of the wall, on the Afghan side of the wall, over the wall. If that practice is taking place in the Afghan government or the Afghan military, our mission can't be accomplished. Morally, we do have a duty to step in and stop it. The incrementalist approach would say the first thing that we try is pressure on the Afghan military to do so. The second thing you try might be less help, less training, less lessons, less guns, less weapons. If none of that helps, you need to start considering a change in mission, because if taking away all help doesn't get it done, you might not be able to help.
Also, from a legal standpoint, we can still go in since they are working with us.
2 minutes remaining.
As mentioned in the U.S. Code 3261, when we are working with and training other forces, we can still go in and implement our own laws into that policy.
How does your approach to the solution impact changing the overall Afghan culture? It appears that you've worked on changing the military's behavior, changing the local police behavior, but not John Q. Citizen, who's outside.
Well, sir, the truth is that overall Afghan culture on the whole does not accept the practice of Bacha Bazi. It's against the law via the Afghan government. It was against the law versus the Taliban government. And as you can read in the case, there are very, very often instances of mothers running, crying to American military bases, please save my son, please save my daughter. In general, the practice is not accepted across Afghanistan. And in general, we think that the culture of the entire country doesn't need to change in regards to Bacha Bazi, but in order to accomplish our mission, it needs to change in regards to the trust of the military, the Afghan military. And if the Afghan military is seen as corrupt because of Bacha Bazi, that's where cultural change needs to happen on a broad, sweeping level. And the way that you make that happen is by getting rid of Bacha Bazi within the military.
But do the people of Afghanistan see this practice being carried on by the Afghan military, the Afghan police,
whatever local political powers are abusing it. So is there a standing forward in Afghanistan, a political power that is willing to do something about it, that you can even talk to on a general basis, because you really confine this to those things that are brought on to a base or our base, or perhaps if you see something on patrol, you report. But
Unfortunately,
Bacha Bazi is a part of life there, okay? And the Taliban is rigorous in the way it looks at certain parts of the Quran, some respect, but we don't. And they can stop it through ruthless power. But where is that same ruthless power on the side of right in the Afghan government? And isn't your mission, you know, always hazardous by not being able to get the Afghan government or the Iraqi government to behave as a democratic government as we would?
yes, sir. The mission is always dangerous in trying to set up democratic governments and not being able to work with authoritarian governments like the Taliban. And yes, some form of strong power needs to come down on the practice to ensure it doesn't stop. Hopefully it's not ruthless like the Taliban, and we are of the opinion that yes, the practice can be suppressed and the practice can be weeded out of Afghan culture without a ruthless and Quran and theological-based approach like that of the Taliban. However, if that proves to not be true after trying, then there's not a whole lot of counterinsurgency that we can't accomplish.
Your time's up, I'm sorry. Thank you for the presentation.